Thanks very much for letting an environmental person come into this food sphere. And I thought I'd start very briefly by giving you a sense of environmental legislation. There is a tremendous amount of it, and it takes many different forms. It's mostly directives. It's the EU environmental legislation. It's probably the most comprehensive in the world. There's 200 or 300 pieces of legislation, more depending on how you count it. Some of it covers transboundary issues, including climate. Some of it is very relevant to health issues, including water quality, for example, chemicals policy, for example. Some of it's linked to international obligations. A lot of it's linked to the single market. Some of it defines very, very specific standards, and some of it sets long-term goals, for example, to have good ecological quality in water across the board. It's extremely ambitious, some of it. And in some cases, it actually specifies what means to be used. As we heard about food policy just now, exactly what process, but that's pretty unusual in environment policy. It's much more outcome-based than process-based. And unlike virtually any other policy in the EU, it's highly programmatic. There's a 5-year look ahead which tells you, or 7-year look ahead tells you which direction environment policy is going, so-called environmental action programs. And this has been quite a systematic, well-signposted system. And people in a water authority, in a local authority, who wonder where EU policy is going, they have a pretty good idea. This doesn't in any way corresponds to what happens in national policy, or indeed in most other areas of EU policy. This policy is still being extended, and it's copied in large amounts to the rest of the world simply because it is more detailed, more specific, more elaborated. It's had a very big influence in the UK. Most of our environmental policy outside land use planning is based on EU law, EU policy. And it's extended the ambitions, the scope of EU environment policy, UK policy enormously. It's made us much more aware of cross-border issues, and some of the older members of the audience will remember our nice habit of dumping sewage sludge in the North Sea, which didn't appeal to our neighbours, export of sulfur dioxide, Scandinavia, in the form of acid rain, and so forth. You know, we have been civilized in the sense of having to stop some of our more polluting habits. We've had arguments with our continental neighbours about how to resolve some quite concrete issues about what's the best way of dealing with water pollution, with waste, and so forth. The UK has been a major player in the creation of this edifice, sometimes ahead of the pack, sometimes behind the pack, sometimes intervening very directly. David Cameron sent a letter to the Commission saying, do not under any circumstances introduce regulation on fracking, for example, and they didn't. So the UK has not been in any sense a minor player in this story. Of course, the most important, in a way, attribute which people will be familiar with is that compliance with EU law has a very different feeling about it than compliance with domestic legislation. If the government fails to comply, it faces a whole system under the treaty, which involves letters, court appearances, ultimately fines. And therefore, the government and the government agencies very often will prioritize EU goals and objectives over national ones. They are not free to adopt their own timetable. They are not free to cut expenditure indefinitely if they choose to do so. They are bound. It is a binding set of agreements. And if you look at the difference between, for example, the way we protect nature and habitats in the UK prior to the Habitats Directive, which is under the Berne Convention, Council of Europe Convention, with very similar requirements to the Habitats Directive, versus what's happened after the Habitats Directive, which is a binding measure, it is extremely different because it's a binding measure. And of course, that is why a lot of organizations which are opposed to the EU don't like it, because it does introduce binding measures. That's the key point. And if we look ahead then, maybe I'll go back. back a bit. Influences on the UK from the EU are many because we've had to adopt to this wide range of different legal measures and non-legal measures. And it's also worth saying the UK has had an influence over other member states in quite a large measure, which again we don't hear about. And so some of them are interested in what life would be like without the UK at the table as well. The complexities of departure are considerable. Now, if I speculate a little bit about what might happen if we did leave, there are reasons to think that we probably in the UK would maintain a lot of our general climate ambitions because, unlike most European countries, we have a binding Climate Change Act. Similarly, most product standards, which are numerous, would probably stay in place, and exactly the same reasons that food hygiene, food safety measures, which we've already talked about. On the other hand, I would anticipate air quality ambitions being scaled back because they are difficult and expensive to meet. The UK is one of the main lobbyists against air quality standards. London is one of the countries, not the only part of the UK, but many parts of the UK can't meet ambient air quality standards. And in fact, I saw in one of the newspaper headlines this morning, the UK was indeed looking at some measures to scale that back. We would have certainly less binding measures on renewable energy. The UK is the main member state opposed to binding targets for member states on renewable energy. We'd have a more liberal regime on that. We'd almost certainly have slower progress on waste recycling and the circular economy because, again, the UK is quite explicitly clear that this should be conducted essentially on a voluntary model rather than a binding one. And has influenced the Commission's recent proposals. And it's not the only country that thinks that, but certainly one of the most prominent ones. And then there's the issue of nature conservation. There's a so-called fitness check of the nature directives going on at the moment. And it's interesting, the corresponding processes, again, in food law. And we've got quite a lot of experience in environment fitness checks. And this one is detailed scrutiny. And the UK, again, has been on the record as one of the most sceptical countries about the binding provisions, certain aspects of the provisions of nature directives. And then when it comes to agriculture, we had a bit of discussion about this morning. I'm afraid I'm one of the people who goes to talk to the Treasury from time to time. And if you do, it's very, very difficult to imagine them wanting to propose anything but a significant cut in payments for agriculture. They have said that since 2005, clearly, over and over and over again. And I find it quite difficult to imagine a scenario which would not include that. Of course, from the environmental point of view, there's an issue. Would a future government or whatever political persuasion keep up agri-environment, organic payment schemes or not? I mean, again, they're heavily funded by the EU. They could be maintained, but they might not be. It depends how cynical you are. I want to spend a minute or two, if I may, on departure scenarios. Because for the environment, they are a little bit clearer in some ways than for other areas of policy. We talked before about the sort of EFTA, the EEA options. I'm personally quite cynical about the Swiss option for reasons I could expand on. And as the previous speaker said quite clearly, the exit scenario is not one for the UK to dictate. It's one to negotiate with all parties. Every single member state can veto our new arrangements. It's really impossible to overestimate the importance of that. Now, if we went into the EFTA-only model, and that's the Swiss model, there would be a lot of continuous negotiations between the UK and the EU on environmental regulations. So leaving that aside for a minute, if we went into the EEA model, so that's Norwegian in normal day-to-day language, there is participation in some measures. Norwegian officials do go to some meetings, but they do get sent out of the room. And it'd be interesting to have a bit of discussion about exactly how this works. They have no say over the standards. It's exactly the same as food law. And a lot of environmental regulation would continue to apply, including many of the most important measures, but some would not, including the Birds, Habitats and Bathing Water directives, all of which are quite sensitive, and some of which are highly controversial. The CAP and the Common Fisheries Policy would not apply either, and as we've already heard, the UK would carry on making budgetary contributions. So the Treasury would be bearing those costs before it started figuring out how much it wanted to pay for agriculture, or for fisheries, I should say, which is another heavily subsidized sector with EU money. So if we think about a process, how this would proceed, you have to have a deal with the EU about your terms of exit, and at the same time, in parallel, a negotiation about the new terms. This goes on at the same time. And as you're doing that, you negotiate with alternative partners, and on some scenarios, we heard this morning about 60-plus free trade agreements. In addition to that, we might be negotiating with EEA or EFTA members. So we go into a permanent negotiation. This is what it will be like, an enormous and perpetual, which is going to be quite difficult to maintain transparency inside this process. And I was quite recently at a meeting of lawyers, and there was an argument like, well, have we got enough lawyers to actually do this? And, well, you know what lawyers are like, yeah, probably we have. But it could be tough, just like that. And, of course, there are not that many civil servants out there in the way that there were. So probably there would have to be some kind of rollover and sort of deep freeze mechanism. We would certainly expect a prolonged period of uncertainty with environmental consequences across the board, really. And we would also have to live with a situation where EU law would move on. I mean, the EU is at the moment, as we've heard already this morning, in a kind of in a period of reticence in the extreme about new regulation, and that applies to the environment the same as it does to food. On the other hand, new legislation will need to be put in place. For example, next year on climate, Paris has happened. The EU is the main mechanism for pushing that into law. So that won't just stand still. The UK environmental policy is totally bound up with EU policy. The two would be extremely difficult to tear apart. And so what we would end up with is the need not only for mechanisms we've heard about before, but some vision of our own, which we actually haven't had for several decades, about what our own priorities are. You know, we are in reactive mode. There's a proposal for the Commission, and we say, well, we like it or we don't. So as well as the institutional changes, as well as the inevitable negotiation with other partners who are making the running and having to put up with what they propose, we would need to create our own energy system, our own dynamic. And so we can't say exactly what the outcome would be, and some people obviously are very optimistic about what a future UK government might do. You might have a green and very enlightened government. You might have a highly sceptical one. But it seems to me that in the debate we've had up to now, the risks to the environment, much as they are to food safety, have been very considerably underestimated. And I don't think it's going to get a lot clearer what the alternatives will be. The government is not going to say suddenly, this is the alternative. I think we're going to have to make up the alternatives a little bit ourselves. We have to see what they're likely to be and make some judgments on that. And that is quite an onus on people in civil society, well, not only in civil society, but in the informed institutions, because this stuff is not self-evident. It needs interpretation, it needs discussion, it needs participation. So thanks very much for organising this today.